Alright, hello and welcome to the course. Let's just dive right in here to one of my finished animation loops, except for the background. We have a pretty good character loop here, and this is one of the examples of what you can do in Procreate once you understand some of the tools I'm about to show you. So first and foremost, what you're going to want to do, let's just start a new file here, is create a canvas that will allow you to have a reasonable amount of space for animation. Now I'm using Procreate on the iPad and I'm using an Apple Pencil and a Magic Keyboard. You technically don't need those last two things, but it makes it a whole lot easier. So first what I'm going to do in this upper right hand corner is to switch my color to black. Then I'm going to hit this wrench right here and I'm going to switch to the Canvas tab. After which you're going to see me click on Animation Assist. And that's going to bring up this little timeline at the bottom here, and you'll notice there's only one frame right now. If I were to draw anything, that shows up on that frame. And if you want the next frame, you simply click Add Frame. After which you can see that the image is now ghosted. We can see a tinted up version or a low opacity version of what we had in the previous drawing. This means that we can make our next drawing with a reasonable degree of confidence, knowing that we're going to be following our principles of motion here. Before we get into too much animation talk, which will be the focus of later lessons, let's get into some of these settings because we're going to need to understand these. So the onion skin opacity will, as you can see, bring up and down the amount in which you can see your previous frames. I usually like to keep it at around 60 or 50, but sometimes it gets a little muddy if there are too many of them. Frames per second is going to dictate how fast or slow the animation plays, and the onion skin frames will denote how many frames you're going to be seeing before and after the frame you're currently on. So if I were to go ahead and just quickly add a couple more frames here with not a ton of animation principles in mind, which we're going to be learning later, you can see I'm creating a very loose, very rough animation with this circle, just sending it all over the canvas here. And now it is pretty much gone. So with our settings here, if I scroll around, maybe to like the middle of the animation, you can see that you're not only able to see the previous frames, but the frames that come after it. However, if you're starting at the beginning, you're obviously only going to see the frames that go after your current frame. And if you're all the way at the end, you're only going to see frames that are going before that current frame. The current frame being denoted by the little blue section beneath any given frame. That's the frame you're on. And all you really need to do is slide back and forth with your finger or your Apple Pencil in order to have the timeline scroll. Next, you can hit play, and then you can see the animation, as terrible as it is at this point, of our circle that we drew several frames for. And you see that wasn't that hard. We just added a bunch of frames and drew a circle moving across the page. And that's pretty much animation at its rawest format. It is the persistence of motion that we get when we have a bunch of frames running one after another and we try to keep the drawings consistent between those frames. And of course we're going to get into more of that as the course proceeds. But just really quickly to finish up our section here, you can set it to ping pong, wherein it'll play backwards and forwards as opposed to looping, which can be good if you have designed your animation to look better for ping pong mode. Or you could just do one shot, meaning it'll only play through once, and then you'll have to prompt it again to play. Otherwise, you can set it to loop. Again, I like to use between 1 to 3 frames for onion skin. Frames per second is how fast the animation is going to play, so it's obviously much faster as we bring the frames per second up, getting pretty crazy. And if we bring them down, you barely have the persistence of motion that I was alluding to earlier when it comes to animation. So you can just barely tell it's animated once the frames per second starts getting really low. Typically I like to sit at about 15. That's just personal preference. The standard is usually 24 with things animated on 2s. To wrap up this lesson, I'll show you what that means. So it's going pretty fast right now at 24 frames per second, but if we click any given frame, we're going to get a couple different options in addition to some of the settings that we have in this little animation timeline. So hold duration just means how many frames it's going to be held for. That's 5 frames of holding, and this is 1. So animating on 2s at 24 frames per second basically just says that you're holding each frame for 2 frames. So you have your initial frame and the frame that follows by switching the hold duration to 1. You can also, of course, take certain frames off of hold if you want them to go faster than others, which we will talk more about when it comes to timing and spacing, but that part will be much quicker in the middle now. And you can see that the timing and spacing is actually more interesting than when we first started our animation. So this is animation at its core, at its simplest in Procreate, and it is a great way to get started. Alright, so for your assignment portion, I just want you to be able to open up a new document. You can use your 2 fingers pinched together to zoom out, after which I want you to turn on, under the Canvas tab, the Animation Assist, and I want you to just draw and add some frames. Doesn't matter if it's a good animation at this point at all. We just want to get used to the process, get used to touching the buttons in the interface that are going to give us the results we want. And then you can also remember to learn to hit play, as well as be able to play with some of your settings, like your frames per second. You turn off your amount of onion skin or lower it down to what you like. All those basics we talked about in the first lesson. Once you're able to play an animation through and alter the frame rate in the onion skin, you're ready to move on.